Okay, here we go. Showtime. Welcome to the show. Take this time for yourself, folks. Kick your feet back on your most comfy chair. You've worked hard all week and you deserve this time for yourself. Get the coffee going, get the tea going, or a beverage of choice. Now, as I drove into the studio tonight, typically I drive by magnificent, the lakeshore, Lake Ontario. The scenery in Kingston, folks, it's summertime, is stunningly beautiful. However, last summer, Kingston experienced a bizarre occurrence, a drought, and water was rationed. Now think about this for a second, folks. We live on Lake Ontario, a great lake, yet water was rationed. This winter was the weakest winter I have ever seen in all my 21 years. Did I say 21? In all my years. Very little snow, folks, and temperatures so high, normal areas of Lake Ontario that usually freeze didn't. So what does that mean? Well, it means that ice that would normally cover and protect this huge body of water from the sun rays and reflect them back, thus preventing evaporation, didn't happen. When this lake goes down an inch, folks, that's a heck of a lot of water gone. Our spring was also late this year by about a month. Normal weather patterns are disrupted as never before. We are seeing more and more signs of global warming right across the globe. Extreme weather, places that have never had droughts before, floods where floods never occur, warm winters, hottest blazing summers ever on record are all evidence that something is amiss. The book is called Horsemen of the Apocalypse, The Men Who Were Destroying Life on Earth and What It Means for Our Children. It's written by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Dick Russell, and David Talbot. Our guest tonight, Dick Russell, is an acclaimed environmental writer with special expertise on the crisis that is confronting the world's oceans and fisheries. He's the author of Striper Wars, An American Fish Story, and Eye of the Whale. Dick has authored best-selling books with Jesse Ventura as well. His groundbreaking book, The Man Who Knew Too Much, is considered a classic and a must-read in JFK assassination literature. Now, about this book, folks, Academy Award-winning actor and environmental activist Leonardo DiCaprio said, a must-read for anyone concerned with climate and energy issues. Okay, let's jump in right away, shall we? What's in the news right now, Dick, of course, is the United States has pulled out the Paris Climate Accord. Can you tell us and the listeners what the Paris Climate Accord is and what it means by the United States pulling out, the consequences thereof?
Yeah, the consequences, Brent, are huge. I mean, this treaty was negotiated back at the end of 2015 by 196 countries that have signed it, which means that all of these nations are pledging to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions with a time frame. It's not going to happen overnight. We're not going to phase out completely from fossil fuels, obviously, overnight. But there's a time frame there because of the situation.
So Dick's Skype just froze up, folks. I guess I'll have to call him back. Just give me a second. Okay, so I gotta hang up on Dick. There we go. And call him right back. He's back.
All right, good. I don't know what's going on, but
NSA.
Yeah, for sure.
That's what I always say. The NSA's at work. Yeah. I think the same thing happened when Jesse was on, to tell you the truth, Dick.
Did it really?
Yeah, so I just always make the same joke. The NSA is listening. So we were talking about the Paris Climate Accord for the folks and what that means, the consequences by the United States pulling out.
Yeah, what the treaty was supposed to do was all the big industrial nations especially, but 196 countries were agreeing to do everything they could to keep the temperature from rising more than 2 degrees centigrade. That's still a lot. And we're in fact just there right now. But anyway, the Clean Power Plan that Obama put in place was designed to cut our emissions, and mainly from electric utilities, from coal burning utilities, by almost 30% by 2020. And it was already in effect. Lots of states were already going big time to solar and wind and other forms of alternative energy. Alternative energy is already making tremendous strides in this country. The solar industry, for example, there were 24,000 jobs 10 years ago. There are 224,000 jobs now in solar. There are more new jobs created every year in solar and wind than there are in oil and gas combined. So, you could say that fossil fuels are a dinosaur. And in fact, that's, fossil fuels is where has been going for a little more than 100 years, and they should become extinct rather soon. But
Trump made several quotes, and I'd like you to comment on them. The first quote is, "We're getting out, but we still want to negotiate. We will see if we can make a deal that's fair." How is that inaccurate?
Well, it's inaccurate because the deal's already been made. And, these countries aren't going to sit down and renegotiate something with the United States at this point. I mean, Trump's a deal maker. That's all he's ever done his entire life, is he thinks he can bamboozle people into making big deals. And, it's just not going to happen. In fact, immediately after he said that, all of these countries all over the world were saying, he's crazy, which we don't want to comment on that yet. But, that this was just not going to happen. That the negotiations were completed, the accord was signed. Especially the European countries, the European Union, and China, by the way, are really doing everything they can to move quickly to an alternative energy future. So that's what's going on, and Trump is living with his head in the sand.
Okay, you mentioned China. There's another quote he made about China, and China will be allowed to build hundreds of additional coal plants. So we can't build the plants, but they can, according to this agreement. Now, India will be allowed to double its coal production by 2020. How is this false?
It's an argument that's been false for a long time. I mean, the so-called developing nations, which China used to be, now is moving way ahead, of course, and India, they were blamed by the big countries were saying, they were saying, we're not going to do it if you guys won't do it, and vice versa. But now, I mean, look what just happened last week. Governor Jerry Brown of California goes to China to talk to them about putting in place huge new plans for alternative energy. I mean, the solar industry in China is booming, and they're facing the facts that the coal industry has polluted their country terribly. I mean, they got the worst pollution in some of these cities where people are wearing gas masks. So, not to mention climate change, and they are moving quickly to take global leadership of what's got to be done to do something about climate change, while the U.S. Sits with its thumb up its butt. So, it's just that's what's going on.
Even the military is on board about climate change. And let me read you something from Secretary of Defense James Mattis. And folks, this is a direct quote from him. "Climate change can be a driver of instability and a challenge that requires a broader, whole-of-government response." Retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral David Titley said, "In Syria, a drought about a decade ago was one link to a long chain of events that helped result in the civil war there," and we know what's going on there already. Now, also, the world's largest naval base, the naval station at Norfolk, is always under extreme flooding conditions, and it's only getting worse. The other thing is, too, they discovered this during the Gulf War, is that Abrams tanks and Humvees are all gas guzzlers. No kidding. You have a multi-ton tank in a Humvee. I mean, they get, 3 or 4 miles to the gallon. Think of the logistics that has to happen to fuel these defense weapons. Think of the logistics of the men, the women, the transportation, and to get the oil over there and in theater. And often what will end up happening, same thing happened in the Second World War, you ended up with the front moving so quickly because the Germans were collapsing. The same thing happened against Saddam Hussein, that the resources, the fuel, if you will, couldn't keep up. So they started looking right away in the 90s at alternative green energies that could be renewed right there on the battlefield. There's also the issue, folks, of natural disasters. Think of Katrina, forest fires in California, flooding everywhere. All this takes military resources as well in terms of relief efforts and rescue efforts. Could you comment on the military's move towards green and what that means for the Trump administration by standing firm denying climate change?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, you've got the Trump administration wanting to.
It's going to be a fun night, isn't it, folks? I don't know. You know, I've got him on camera, and it looks really good. I'll tell you that. It looks really, really good. But for some reason, he keeps getting bounced off. So I'll try again. Oh, you're back, Dick. There you go. You're back.
Am I back?
You are.
Okay.
Yeah.
Good.
We're talking about the military and climate change and what that
Yeah.
means because the Trump administration is coming out again. And I never thought I'd be pro-military, ever. You know, military-industrial complex and stuff, and yet they seem to be making all the right moves. Perhaps the desired outcome isn't one that we desire, which is, you know, the ability to wage war much easier. But certainly they're making all the right moves by going green.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know how fast they're going green, but the fact is that they've been warning for some time now that the biggest national security threat actually facing the United States is the threat of climate change. And of course, if you look at countries all over the Middle East, I mean, the droughts, the flooding that's going to happen in a lot of places. I mean, Syria is a very good example of this. I mean, the Syrian civil war was really caused by climate change, and the fact that this drought has sent so many, you know, more than 1 million refugees fleeing the country beyond what the war itself was doing. So, yeah, I mean, and here on the one hand, Trump is putting $54 billion into the military budget, while at the same time he's just gutting the Environmental Protection Agency budget, you know, by 30-some%. Even what's really Orwellian is that they're taking climate change off, you know, the EPA website. I mean, any references to it in the Clean Power Plan, they're vanishing as if, you know, they never existed, as if we can, you know, completely ignore what's going on. So, and this is true of NASA, it's true of NOAA, it's true of many of these agencies where you can't even utter the words anymore. Now, this is what we've elected to be president of the United States. I mean, anti-science, 98% of the scientists in the world say that this is happening, that it's very real, that it's a threat unlike civilization has ever faced before. And instead, you know, Trump claims that the science is bogus and that it's all the fault of the Chinese, is what he said during the Chinese are making this up as a hoax, is what he said during the campaign. I mean, to me, that's flat out insanity.
Some numbers here, folks. The 2018 budget proposal, which aims to slice the environmental regulatory's overall budget by 25%. 25%. And they want a staff reduction of 20%.
Yeah.
What is going on here? And yet the increase to the military. Is the military taking over the EPA? In terms of, you know, we just mentioned they're going green. Are they going to be doing the research and warning corporations to stay within the realms of environmental health?
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, one of the people that I profile in the book tangentially, because the chapter about Oklahoma is mostly about Harold Hamm, who's the big fracker down there. He's the fracker extraordinaire, the guy who pioneered the fracking of the Bakken shale field in North Dakota. He's a multi-billionaire, and we can talk more about him. But Scott Pruitt, who's now running the EPA, was basically his man. Hamm helped get him elected twice.
I was going to bring up Scott Pruitt and Harold Hamm, if you could tell some of the dastardly things Scott Pruitt has done. And now he's the head of the EPA. He brought a bunch of lawsuits and things of that nature.
Yeah, when Pruitt was the Attorney General of Oklahoma for 2 terms, he was the one who set out to enlist attorneys general in, I think it was 28 other states, to sign on to trying to get rid of renewable energy in their areas and basically gut the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. It was a lawsuit that they were suing the federal government and saying you couldn't put this power plant in place. Well, you know, this didn't go forward, but it was still a very serious threat. And Pruitt is a guy who really basically wants to dismantle the very agency that he is now sworn to run and uphold the environmental safety of the American people, including all the science, including, you know, the studies of toxicity, of chemical pollution, all these things that are so important to our future and our kids' future, let alone climate change. And all this is, basically he'd just like to see it destroyed. And Ham, the whole Oklahoma is an interesting place. I mean, it's basically was built on oil and gas. And I'm not saying that at the time they knew that this was a terrible thing, but back in 1908, but they do now. And yet these energy titans like Ham and the guy who runs Devon Energy, they put people like Pruitt in their pocket, and people like Inhofe, who's the senator from Oklahoma, who is the chair of the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee. He's the guy who a few years ago made fun of Al Gore, saying, well, we got a lot of snow in Washington, you don't want to live in an igloo, it's global cooling. I mean, Inhofe is a total climate denier. Well, he's from Oklahoma. And Ham, interesting guy. He's a wildcatter. He started off he's an independent, started off an impoverished youth, worked his way up. Now he's a multi-billionaire. And what I learned about, and when I was in Oklahoma and wrote quite a bit about in the book, was the fact that Oklahoma now leads the country in the number of earthquakes that happen every year. A staggering increase in the amount of earthquakes. And this is due to the hydraulic waste fracturing disposal of the waste from their fracking of these wells, and they pump the wastewater down these wells, and what it does is it triggers, because Oklahoma has a certain kind of geology, it triggers these faults along the fault line, and earthquakes have been increasing. They've had them as big as 6.5, including in places like Cushing, Oklahoma, which is this transport hub for oil, and there's I went to Cushing. There's so many barrels of oil there. It's just in these huge tanks, and it's scary.
Let me ask you this then. Joe Average like me can make the correlation between fracking and an increase in earthquakes. Does the oil company or perhaps the government not make that same correlation?
What Ham did was go to the University of Oklahoma and say, you've got the geological survey, you're claiming that they're saying that the science shows that these earthquakes are being caused by the fracking practices that my company and others are doing. Well, we got to muzzle that guy. We can't let the people of Oklahoma think this. It's just a natural occurrence. So they set out to, finally the guy, Austin Holland, he quit. And I interviewed a number of people in Oklahoma about this, whose homes and livelihoods have been destroyed by earthquakes. It's pretty staggering. And but Ham, these guys don't care. I mean, they're basically out for their bottom line, and that's it.
Yeah, it's amazing how Scott Pruitt also got the job he got. I mean, that's an amazement to me, because during his January 18th, 2017 confirmation hearing to the EPA, he said that the climate is changing. Well, at least he acknowledges that, folks. And human activity contributes to that in some manner. However, in March 2017, he seemed to backpedal. He said that he does not believe that human activities, specifically carbon dioxide emissions, are a primary contributor to climate change. A view, he says, is in contradiction with the scientific consensus. So you can't have it one way or the other. And that's
Exactly.
what it comes down to, He also said that he pulled out of the Paris Agreement, and he asserted that China and India have no obligations until 2030 under the Paris Agreement.
Not true.
It's not true, and it was deemed false also by the Washington Post. So, as Oklahoma Attorney General, Pruitt sued the EPA at least 14 times. So he
Right.
sues the EPA, folks. Now he's the head of it. Now, obviously, he's a plant there to destroy the EPA. I mean, I'm just drawing correlations. Call me a conspiracy theorist if you want, but it seems very obvious why he's there.
Sure.
Your comments on this information I just read?
Yeah, well, it is obvious. I mean, Pruitt did exactly what you say he did. Now he's all in favor of pulling out of the Clean Power Plan. He was very much in favor of pulling out of the Paris Agreement, totally ignoring the fact that just in recent history, 17 of the past 18 years, I believe, have been the hottest ever recorded, that the Arctic sea ice is melting at just an alarming rate, and the methane that's trapped in the permafrost, which is even a worse contributor to global warming than carbon dioxide, is, tons of that are going to be pouring into the atmosphere. So we could see changes very quickly that we hadn't anticipated. Already scientists are saying, things are heating up much faster than, and tornadoes are escalating and hurricanes much faster than we had anticipated. And now the glaciers in Antarctica are melting, the ice sheets, and the Thwaites Glacier, if it goes, and there've been a lot in the press recently about this, and scientists are there watching it. If that glacier goes, we could see sea level rise relatively quickly of between 10 and 13 feet along the coastlines of the United States and other parts of the world. You know what that means?
New Orleans
unthinkable.
toast.
Gone.
Yeah, completely wiped out.
Yeah.
You know, you mentioned the Arctic, and I was just reading yesterday in the Canadian news that there was a bunch of environmental scientists that were on board a Canadian icebreaker and part of the Coast Guard in Canada, and they were going up to do all kinds of research for 4 months, folks, on the environment and how climate change is affecting the Arctic. It was canceled. You want to know why? Too much ice in the waters. No kidding. They weren't expecting that kind of ice in those waters as far south as they were. So they had to cancel it and return to safe quarters. True story. Let's go on. Let's talk about some of the other people you mentioned in the book. Rex Tillerson, he's now Secretary of State, but he had a more nefarious beginning, I would say, if you will. Can you talk about him a little bit?
Yeah, I didn't intend for my book to be prophecy, but I wrote the book before and profiled these people, including Tillerson, who I led off with, before he was suddenly Secretary of State. But Rex Tillerson was for about 20 years the president and CEO of ExxonMobil, as it's now called. And in that capacity, he was basically for years a climate change denier. And even today, as someone who says, yeah, well, it's happening and we probably should have stayed in the Paris Agreement. But, we don't have to worry that much about it. It's not going to happen that fast. It was always the bottom line to him. And what's really unbelievable about Exxon, which has come out in the last year or so, this is the biggest oil company on the planet.
Yep.
I mean, billions and billions of dollars.
Yeah.
It was interesting. Before I went to Tillerson's, I went to Texas to research Tillerson, and his office is in Dallas, and he has a ranch in a little town called Bartonville, where a lot of wealthy people live in the suburb, Texas suburb. And so I went to his ranch. Of course, I didn't expect to get in, and I didn't. But what was really fascinating was right outside of his gate there was a sculpted metal globe, which had these pieces carved out of the whole upper part of it, as if somebody had just taken a scalpel to it and carved up the world. And I thought, wow, is that ever symbolic? I took a picture of it, and I left for a while. When I came back, they had a security truck there, not letting anybody like me up close and personal again. So, but here's the thing about Exxon. I mean, they knew, their own scientists knew as far back as 1977, they were studying this, and what the impact might be on their company in the future and the oil production, and also, interestingly, what places might open up that they couldn't drill in before, such as the Arctic, if the ice melted there. So anyway, they were studying this for a long time. I talked to one of the scientists who was involved in the study named Martin Hoffert, and he was still really outraged because these studies were completely buried. I mean, the company bosses knew, they knew in-house, they never released this information to the public. Instead, what they did was continue to fund these big climate denier organizations, these so-called nonprofits like the Heartland Institute and these similar, what's called right-wing think tanks. And they would pour tons of money into these places before Tillerson. I mean, Lee Raymond was his predecessor, and they were doing it then and convincing the Bush administration. They were the lead people who convinced the Bush administration not to become part of the Kyoto Protocol, which was the international treaty that preceded the Paris Accord and didn't go far enough. But anyway, so Exxon was involved in a cover-up of an unconscionable magnitude. And Tillerson presided over that while at the same time burying not only the truth their scientists knew about what was going on, but also burying alternative possibilities. I mean, they were looking at fuel cells, electric cars. They were looking at these things, 20 years ago. They could have cornered the market on what the Toyota Prius ended up doing. They were ahead of Toyota. But they didn't want any possible threat to their fossil fuel industry. So that's the history that we're living with. And, there's some big lawsuits going on now we can talk about, too. One in particular that is hopefully going to expose even more about this.
Yeah, we can talk about the Children's Foundation lawsuit right away if you want. We can go there. I just want to finish off with Rex Tillerson with this quote, folks. And this is what he said. This is the former boss of Exxon Oil, now the United States Secretary of State. And his famous quote from the book is, "What good is it to save the planet if humanity suffers?" Trying to probe that for a second. Okay, let's talk about, I was going to go to Rick Berman. Let's go down and talk about Judge Coffin and also the Children's Trust lawsuit.
Yeah, let me finish one thing with Tillerson.
Sure.
I think
Please.
is interesting, because I've wondered about why did this guy in particular get named as Secretary of State? Well, it turns out he has an interesting relationship with the Russians, which have come as these Russians have come up quite a bit lately, to say the least. Back in 2014, he, with Exxon, obviously signed a deal with the big Russian oil company Rosneft to do drilling in the Arctic Ocean. It was a huge deal, really a big deal. And Tillerson then, in fact, received the highest award that a foreigner can get, the Russian Medal of Friendship, personally from Vladimir Putin. So it makes you wonder. Now Exxon's saying, the new CEO, Darren Woods, is talking about how, we're still very interested in working with the Russians and doing exploration over there. And it makes you wonder, how far does this Russian connection go? Was part of this really about some kind of oil deal that is being hushed up? I mean, there's a lot we don't know about this Russia connection, and I think that could well be part of it.
Let me interject this about the Arctic, folks. The Arctic was frozen over for years and years and years. It's only recently begun to break up. It was always considered part of Canada's north. We always used to brag that Santa Claus was indeed a Canadian, because that's where the North Pole was. I'm making jest, but that's true. We would always follow at Christmas time the NORAD maps, and the guys at NORAD would report for the little kids, where Santa Claus was coming across and things of that nature. Now that the ice is being removed by climate change, all of a sudden Russia is claiming this territory as their own. Norway is involved now. And, nobody wanted it when it was just snow and ice, except Canada. It was always considered part of Canada. Now that there's something underneath the ice that's gettable, everybody's after it. So I think you're onto something there, Dick. I think you're onto more of kind of backroom deals that are going on with all of this. And I wouldn't be at all surprised to find some kind of congressional investigation somewhere in the future. There's something going on. I don't know what it is, and it makes me, I like Oliver Stone a lot. He did a lot for the JFK community, as you know. But he's just released what I would consider a very positive propaganda documentary on Vladimir Putin. And I've seen him on several talk shows, and he's come out praising him as this great world leader.
Wow. I haven't seen it.
Oh, it's unbelievable. I couldn't believe it. I mean, this guy's a known murderer, and he takes care of his opposition by murdering them. And I have no qualms about saying that right on air. And all of a sudden, a guy with the stature of Oliver Stone comes out and says, no, he truly is a decent guy and a world leader. He's a great guy. Very strange bedfellows. Very, very strange bedfellows, what's going on right now. Okay, let's talk about the Children's Trust lawsuit and some encouraging news for a change. I feel it's encouraging because the judges are on board. Can you explain how this came about and everything? Thank you.
Yeah, yes, there's in Eugene, Oregon, in a federal courtroom, and it's still going on because the case is being allowed to continue. Lawyers are representing this group of young people who are mostly high school age. One of them is a very charismatic young guy from a Native American reservation who's a hip hop artist, and he's one of the plaintiffs, named Martinez. And these kids are saying, our future, our survival, our possibility that we'd have children and grandchildren is threatened by the inaction by the federal government and by these fossil fuel companies to do something about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness that we're going to be denied. And the federal judges in Oregon are hearing this case, and efforts by first it was just against the federal government and for failing to go fast enough, which is of course true. I mean, even Obama came to this a bit late, although he tried to do what he could. Al Gore, of course, was on it years ago, but the Bush administration just turned a blind eye to it. So the problem has been there for a long time, and so first it was just against the federal government, and then these oil companies and coal companies started coming in, wanted to intervene in the lawsuit and shut it down. And this was not allowed. And so it's moving forward. And I think it's been called by Bill McKibben, a big climate activist, and others, this is the most important lawsuit on the face of the planet. Not that many people know about it yet, but you can see online, you can go on there and see some of these kids talking outside the courtroom after some of the victories that so far they've achieved against these powers that be. It's very encouraging.
It sure is, folks, and I give it to today's youth to embark on this journey in the same sense that when we were in the 60s, not me, of course, because I was 21 now, but civil rights, women's rights, gay and transgender rights, we all walk for. Now the kids are taking this on their own shoulders. Now, just let me read this statement by Judge Coffin, who was one of the judges that looked at the attorney's claims, and he agreed with them. And his quote is, "Young people today have been denied protection afforded to previous generations." One more time, young people today have been denied the same protections that we had when we were growing up. They don't have those anymore. And that's profound, that a judge would actually, don't expect him to be a judge too much longer, because apparently Mueller's on his way out too, I just heard. So, it's unbelievable.
It's unbelievable. Every day
there's something new. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, think about the future. I mean, there's going to be globally, if people care about the rest of the world, 25 million more malnourished kids by 2030, and 100 million more facing food insecurity. This is the prediction because of the changing climate. 150 to 200 million people displaced. More than 1 billion people, 1.3 billion, at risk from rising sea levels and floods. And this is, in places like Bangladesh and places that already have terrible, terrible problems with poverty and
fresh water as well, because, we look at sewage, and once sewage backs up, all the diseases that are caused by raw sewage, we know that very well from Katrina in New Orleans. People are still suffering to this day by that. Folks, just till Dick comes back, sea levels by 2100 will be up by 6 feet. 6 feet in less than 100 years. Think about that. These are sea levels. These are huge amounts of water. Huge amounts of water. So 6 feet is an incredible amount. God knows what's going to be left in the Arctic. Will we be even able to walk outside? Who knows? The also excessive heat, folks, affects fetuses, insects. I had a fella on that was down with National Geographic, the lost city of the monkey, the lost monkey city, I think it is by National Geographic. And he was saying that the bugs that are down there are starting to move ever forward. They're in Mexico now and in some of the southern states. Yeah. We've never seen things like this. David Suzuki was on the show, a renowned environmentalist here in Canada, and he was saying that there's a certain bug that has been found in BC that usually dies off over the winters, but the winters are so mild now, the bug's not dying off, and it's killing 100-year-old trees. And it goes on and on and on, and yet we still keep turning the car on and pressing on the gas pedal. Where we're going, it doesn't look good, that's for sure.
It doesn't, but you know what the Koch brothers say, don't you? What David Koch, when he's the another group, two people I profile in the book, and I went to Kansas and spent some time researching there, that's where their home base is, in Wichita. They're the wealthiest private oil and gas people in the world. David Koch and his brother Charles are worth $48 billion apiece. And they'd like nothing more than to take over all of government, which we'll get to maybe in a minute. But David Koch, he was on the board of the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian Institution has what's called the Hall of Human Origins, and the David Koch Hall of Human Origins. And one of the exhibits, is about climate change, and it says basically that not to worry about it too much, because we've always adapted, and we're going to adapt shorter. We're going to live in underground cities, and we're going to adapt shorter, more compact bodies, and then everything is going to be okay. So this is the kind of rationale that people like this are using. I'll talk a little bit more about Kansas for a minute, because Kansas is interesting. There was a piece in the New York Times about it just the other day too. They're all Republican states. The biggest wind-producing states in this country are pretty much all voted for Trump in the last election. And you're talking Texas, Kansas, Iowa, Oklahoma, they all got a lot of wind. And Kansas was really making some tremendous strides, even with a Republican governor, Brownback, and his crazy tax policies, which just got lifted. But anyway, they were starting to build wind turbines all over the place, and wind farms. And the Koch brothers set out to capture the state legislature, first of all, get rid of the people who were in favor of that, and then basically make it not a standard that was already starting to meet the Clean Power Plan for electricity, but they were going to make it a standard that was voluntary, that didn't have to move as quickly. And in fact, it was making people tons of money. I mean, it was cost effective. It was healthy for the environment, just like solar is. And these are, let's face it, these are ways of the future that need to happen, and they are happening. And they're happening many places, especially places like Kansas and Texas where there's a lot of wind. So how they can do that at the same time, if you look at the new administration, the Koch brothers' man in Wichita, he was their personally elected congressman, the one that they really put tons of money into getting him elected, who then went to Congress and did what he could to gut environmental regulations and gut renewable energy regulations, was Mike Pompeo. Now, how the heck did this guy end up running the CIA? I mean, it's very bizarre. He had no experience. I mean, this is another global guy like Tillerson, right, who's going to travel around. I don't know, maybe not travel, I don't know, but he knows privy to all the secrets. And so this is weird, because the Koch brothers did not support Trump during the election. They have funded lots of right-wing groups, the Heartland Institute and others. They've done everything they can to make climate change unreal. But they didn't support Trump at first. But Mike Pence was their guy. He was, when he was named vice president, he'd gotten a lot of financial support from them. And then little by little, they crept into the government after Trump was elected. They made these inroads. And now what's interesting, I just read about this in the New Yorker a little bit ago. There's never been a constitutional convention called in this country since the very beginning, when it was called to do something new, that the Articles of Confederation weren't working, et cetera. Well, now, if you control enough state legislatures, it turns out, and I think we're now the Republicans control 33, I believe, one short of a 2/3 majority of people that could call, even without the federal government being involved, for a new constitutional convention where they could do things like, not just take on abortion rights, like take on civil liberties, take on all these things that are in our Constitution now, and basically set out to get rid of them. I think, that is, without sounding too conspiratorial, the aim of the Koch brothers and the billionaires like them who now control this country as far as running it.
The JFK Assassination, the definitive book by Brent, Holland. From inside the Oval Office to Daily Plaza, first-person witness accounts. Order yours right now. www.nightfrightshow.com.
Do you think the PACs had a big thing to do with that? I'll tell you why. In Canada, we have very limited amounts of money that we can donate to campaigns. Corporations are limited. Unions are limited. The individual is limited. So it's not about the money. It gives Joe Average, like a guy like me, an opportunity to run for Parliament. And, instead
I'd vote for you.
You're very kind. I'm going to call it the Wild Party, or the Saturday Night Party. There we go, so we can have fun. Okay.
Right.
So, do you think this is part and parcel to what's happening in the United States? It just seems to be the uber rich over and over and over again, and Joe Average just hasn't a chance to rise up the ladder. It just takes too much money to get elected. Ted Sorensen told me that, by the way. He wanted to run, and I said, well, why didn't you? He said, I couldn't raise the money. Could you imagine? We could have had Ted Sorensen in government.
It would have been fantastic.
Ted Sorensen, folks, of course, was JFK's speechwriter. He was the guy that was tasked by JFK to write the letter to Khrushchev, to get Khrushchev to back down. He wrote all those wonderful, inspiring words for JFK. And I'm doing some filler here because Dick's gone away again. So obviously the fossil fuel companies or somebody is involved here. And cutting
our pipeline.
Our pipeline. We'll get to the pipeline too. I don't want to leave Canada out of this mess either.
Yeah. Well, yeah. The What were we just talking about?
We were talking about the takeover of government by rich people.
Yeah,
Is that part of the problem in the United States in the electoral system?
It's a huge problem. I mean, Citizens United, which was the Supreme Court decision of a few years ago, just opened the floodgates for anonymous donors to put in billions of dollars from, nonprofits, so-called like Donors Trust, which was set up by the Koch brothers, where you don't have to divulge who you are or how much you're giving. I mean, even that is buried now. So yeah, the oligarchs have been able to take over the political process, and there's really that's why people are so fed up with the political system as it is, both parties, because I don't let the Democrats off the hook with this. I mean, they take billions of dollars from these corporations, and more money is being spent than ever before in these elections. And I think, in part, the dissatisfaction with the two-party system and how it's just completely ruled by money is what led to the election of Donald Trump, except now he's brought all those same people, those big funders, into his government and is hardly someone who you'd say is a man of the people, populist, although that's what a lot of people voted for him based upon.
Okay, you mentioned setting up tax havens, if you will, people that can donate anonymously to various nonprofits. Now, that is a great segue to a fellow by the name of Rick Berman. Now, folks, he's the head of a public relations firm called Berman and Company. On a 60 Minutes report in 2007, he was called Dr. Evil. Isn't that a nice way to be introduced? Now, there's also a quote here I want to read from him, and there's another one here. Okay, here we go. Exploit, this is from Rick Berman. This is his attitude, okay? Exploit emotions like fear, greed, and anger. Anything to diminish the other side's ability to operate. You could not get into people's heads and convince them to do something as easily as you could get into their hearts or into their gut to convince them. Now, here's the part that reminds me of YouTube, folks. Emotions drive people much better than intellectual epiphanies. If you want a video to go viral, have kids or animals showing a video clip that uses school children. Now, that's YouTube all over the place. I just did... This is a shot at YouTube, and I'm going to take it. They've demonetized all shows like this because it talks about reality. What they're doing now is they're only allowing cat videos, makeup videos, and gaming videos to be monetized. Anything to do with controversy, forget it. A very good example, I had Jody Williams on, who won the Nobel Peace Prize for the United States. For what? Banning landmines with Princess Diana. So why did they not monetize this video? Because we talked about landmines, a Nobel Peace Laureate. But a cat video? So this is the society, this is the culture we live in right now. Dangerous as hell to try and get the word out, the truth out. Terrifies me. Can we talk a little bit about Mr. Rick Berman? And he's one of the, as you call them, the men who are destroying life on Earth and what it means for our children. Horsemen of the Apocalypse, Dick Russell, our guest tonight. Can we talk about Rick Berman a little bit?
Yeah, I never had heard of him before I started researching this book, but he's one of those PR geniuses, so-called, who can get out there and set up these fake nonprofits. And he's been involved with the tobacco industry where they used to say, doubt is our big weapon. If we can cast doubt on the fact that cigarette smoking causes cancer, then we're way ahead of the game. That's what they tried to do for years until that $multi-million lawsuit that went against Philip Morris, I think. But, he worked for the tobacco industry. He's worked for Mothers Against Drug Driving. He set up a group. He sets up these phony front groups, BRAD, to counteract MAD, the decoy, I forget some of the names, but, basically these groups to combat Trout Unlimited. He sets up a phony front group to go against them. I must say he's fairly creative in some of his thinking, but it was telling to me that I tried to get a number of the children of some of these fossil fuel magnates or people like Berman to talk to me, and almost none of them would, because I wanted to give also the more positive side, in the sense that there are some of these children of fossil fuel executives who are fighting for a sustainable future, and we'll get to that in a minute. But in Berman's case, his son David, who was a musician, had a band called the Silver Jews, so I guess it was an indie rock band, who suddenly, he was the lead singer, he quit the band back, I guess, about 10 years ago now. And why? Because he spoke about his father. He said, I've got to somehow come to terms with who my father is. He called him a monster. He said, I've been up against him since college days when he was against the unions. And finally, he just got mad as hell and couldn't take it anymore. And he wouldn't actually, he emailed me, but he went viral with his comments about, a few years back. So I included that in the book. Sadly, that's, what's happened. But I'm glad he came out and did it. But there are others, there's a Rockefeller. The Rockefeller family's been amazing. And they're the precursor of Standard Oil, of Exxon, Standard Oil. And so I have a chapter in the book about the Rockefeller family's war against ExxonMobil. And they indeed have gone to war against them. They're still major shareholders. They're some of the major philanthropic funds, the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, the Rockefeller Family Fund, have divested themselves of the stock, come out against what the company is doing. And some of them, like Chris Lindstrom, who's the grandson of the late David Rockefeller, who died just a few months ago, the big banker who some people say ran the world, basically. Chris is pioneering bioenergy. He's part of an organization called Nexus, which is interesting. It's set up for the children of inherited wealth to come together. Once a year they meet all together at the United Nations. I think they're going to meet in July. It's a private gathering where these millennials come together to talk about how they can use their fortunes to both pioneer, innovate new sustainable technologies and in other fields, and basically, try to do something better for the planet than their forebears have done. So Chris is one of these. He's a really good guy. I know him. I know his mom, Abby Rockefeller is his mother, and she's also a strong environmentalist working on agricultural practices, more sustainable agricultural practices, and getting sewage sludge off the land, things like that. And Chris picked up some of her activism, a lot of it actually, and now he's working on a project. It was bioenergy in Jamaica, and now he's putting a lot into hemp, the uses of hemp in a sustainable way for all kinds of things that would be terrific for agriculture and for our economy. So I profiled him in the book, and also a woman named Catherine Lorenz, whose grandfather, George Mitchell, started fracking, pioneered it basically before what it used to be the natural gas. Hydraulic fracturing was thought to be, and it is, it's not as polluting as coal or oil. It still has a lot of problems, which we now know about from movies like Gasland, where people's faucets are catching on, water's catching on fire and so on. But anyway, Catherine Lorenz has established she took over the family foundation, and she's really working hard to pioneer, stronger efforts to get wind energy in Texas. She's been very big behind that and other things. So I had a chapter on her in the book too. So it's not all a doom and gloom book, but I just really felt in writing this book that these guys have got to be exposed, and they've got to be the horsemen of the apocalypse, as I say in the book, have got to be reined in, bridled, and broken. And we've got to expose who these guys are, take them to court, do whatever we got to do, march in the streets, and move toward as quickly as possible to different kinds of energy than they've been promoting.
Different kinds of energy. Mr. Trump just signed a bill ushering back into reality the whole coal industry. What is clean coal? This makes no sense to me, but maybe you could explain it to me, and I'll come out a better man for it somehow.
There's really no such thing as clean coal. I mean, there are cleaner ways to bring coal, to burn coal than the customary ways, but there's no such thing as clean coal. Coal is on its way out. I mean, what's happening in one part of the country, I think in West Virginia, is they're starting to retrain coal miners in the solar industry field. And that's got to happen more and more. I mean, I feel bad for these guys. It's the corporations that have led them down the primrose path. And the fact is that coal companies have been going bankrupt right and left. And companies like Peabody Energy, and I profile their people in the book too, Fred Palmer and their CEO, Greg Boyce. And what they started to do was they just were shipping everything overseas, which is why they want to build these big new terminals in Seattle and places like that. And then they had this, quote, energy poverty campaign, where they did these bogus ads, really, to say that, yeah, we're going to get coal in all these villages in India and other parts of the third world, and we're going to pull people out of poverty with our beautiful coal production over there. Never saying a word about the fact that coal is the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases. I mean, tons and tons every year. Gone down a little bit now that most of these companies are going out of business. But so there's really very few new coal plants on the horizon.
Yeah, it's something that's, as you said before at the outset of the show, it's dinosauric. It's from dinosaurs. Something I want to mention till you come back is the fact we had talked about wind technology before. I live in a place called Kingston, Ontario, folks, nestled snugly between Montreal and Toronto. It's just north of Syracuse by an hour and a half, and just across from Watertown, right in the middle of the St. Lawrence River where it meets Lake Ontario, we have an island called Wolfe Island, WOLFE, named after the British general. On that island, they have 1,800, I think it is, wind turbines, and it powers the whole city of Kingston.
Wow.
Right back into, it's amazing because the wind just races right across Lake Ontario, and it just shoots right down the St. Lawrence. So, I mean, it's windy here all the time. It's like Chicago, same deal. I mean, it's renewable, it doesn't cost anything, and there it is. It's not harming anything. It's amazing what can be done when you put your mind to it.
Yes.
Yeah. So
we've still got, we've got the ingenuity, we've got the technical know-how, we've got people who are, right there ready to make it happen. But everything is still, all the big subsidies are still going to oil and gas, and not into the renewable energy industry where they need to go.
How's mainstream with your book? Have they been cool with it? Have you been able to get on mainstream as well?
Somewhat. I'm afraid that what's happened is that the Trumpocalypse that we're looking at almost every day is upstaging talk of even greater realities, like I'm trying to get the word out about in this book. So
there's the music.
Yeah.
I'm so
I guess
sorry.
we got to face the music again.
At one point. Dick Russell's been our guest tonight, folks. Horsemen of the Apocalypse. You can find it, the link to order the book right on our website. No worries at all for that. Dick, you are welcome here anytime, my friend. You know that. We never got to the oil sands. I apologize. Yeah, come back. That'll be a show in itself. Thank you, my friend.
Thanks so much, Brent.
I'm Brent Holland. Thank you all for joining us. See you next time.